The Mormons' vision of the West was very much an escape from persecution and a fight for religious freedom. And they found their vision to be fulfilled in the Great Salt Lake, where the Mormons called home and built Salt Lake City. They'd been persecuted and bullied in the East for their beliefs, and the lake that was past the Rocky Mountains was isolated, meaning it wasn't going to be contacted by many people, but it did make it hard to trade goods, and the area around Salt Lake was dry and deserted, and was also home to lots of rattlesnakes. So all in all, wasn't the best place to settle, but for them, it was. So a bit more about the Mormons then. So they came from New York, and their founder was a gentleman called Joseph Smith, and his goal was to rebuild God's church on earth. He published his ideas in something known as the Book of Mormon, and he claimed that the book contained a direct translation of gold plates that God had written down and given to him. People decided to follow the Mormons for many different reasons. One of it was because it promised them a better life. They would get shared ownership of land and property. But some people didn't like the Mormons for many reasons. So some people thought that they thought America was about private ownership and individual ownership. They didn't like the fact the Mormons were anti-slavery. They practiced polygamy as well, so that meant having multiple wives. Brigham Young, for example, had 55 wives. They used aggressive conversion tactics as well. And some people personally disliked Smith, thinking he was trying to be too powerful. The Mormons ended up leaving New York because of the increase in hostility towards them. They went to Illinois, but Joseph Smith was actually killed there, and then took over Brigham Young as the leader of the Mormons. They settled then in Salt Lake City in Utah, and they got there by foot on a long trail, carrying all the goods with them on hand carts, not too dissimilar to the early migrants. And by 1852, 10,000 of them had come to Salt Lake, and they'd created kind of a heavily planned society where no one actually owned land. The church owned all of the land and divided it up and decided how much people got. It was actually very much the opposite of what the Mormons moved there for. The Mormons saw Young as a link to God, so they didn't actually challenge any of the ideas that he had and this kind of poor sharing of land. The Salt Lake was really dry, so there was no way they could get water. So Young began an irrigation project, which meant bringing water in from nearby mountains to ensure everyone had a fair share. So the Mormons, their settlement caused quite a lot of conflict as well. So originally they were settled in Illinois, then had to move to Utah, and they applied for Utah to become a state because at the time it was only a territory. If you're a territory, you cannot make your own laws. You have got to follow the laws of the Constitution. So they had their governor as Brigham Young at the helm, but actually what they were doing in terms of land ownership and what they were doing in terms of marriage and polygamy was breaking the Constitution. So they weren't following US law. Also, this came about because Young had plans to spread his settlements of Mormons further across the Utah Territory, and people in the East weren't too happy about this or were quite concerned about it. So the government then sent in troops to Utah to bring the Mormons back in line, say, look, you've got to follow the laws of the US, you're only a territory, you're not a state. And a band of Mormons killed some settlers thinking they were actually US spies, US government spies. And turns out that they weren't. They were just white settlers settled near them, and the Mormons had to try and blame the Native Americans for these murders. Anyway, the scandal came out, and the government found out that it was actually the Mormons that had killed these innocent white settlers, and Young stepped down. Utah was then forced to follow US laws from then on. Our next group of people then, in their vision of the West, is the gold miners. The gold miners wanted to seek their fortune in the West after gold was discovered in the Rockies and California, and thousands of gold prospectors flooded to California, around about 50,000 in just 1 year. They worked all day in the rivers to find gold, and it was particularly backbreaking work. Unfortunately, many of them didn't have much success, and it definitely wasn't worth the frenzy that happened at the start of the announcement of gold. So there were two significant gold rushes in the American West. The first began in California, California Gold Rush of 1848. James Marshall discovered gold at John Sunter's mill in the Sierra Nevada mountains near San Francisco. Some of the miners at this time started using frying pans or anything that they could to find deposits of gold in rivers nearby. And after a short time, mines were opened, and larger nuggets of gold could then be extracted from the mountains themselves. President James K. Polk confirmed the reports that gold had been discovered in California, and rumours then spread across the world, in fact, of people making thousands of pounds a day, and some people having $16 worth of gold just in their beards by the end of the day as well. Over 50,000 Americans headed to California in 1849 alone. And these gold miners, they actually came from Europe, Mexico, China, all across the world, just to get a glimpse of the prospect of making lots of money from gold. Other people also benefited from the gold rush as well, and actually this group of people probably benefited more than the gold miners themselves, the merchants. The merchants sold supplies for 5 to 10 times the normal price that they could, because these gold prospectors were so desperate for the tools that they needed. Often they came with just the clothes on their back. Levi Strauss, the very famous denim company, got rich by producing denim trousers for miners that were seen as quite hard wearing for the troubles of mining. There was also cotton production in the South boosted as a result of this production of denim. Nancy Gooch, the freed slave, worked as a cook or washerwoman woman for the miners, and cooked meals for them, and made a lot of money doing that, to the point where she could buy her freedom. And she also used her money to buy her son's and his wife's freedom from the money that she made from the gold miners. Some further impact for the gold miners and the California gold rush, other than the money made by the merchants, was the fact that lots of them didn't make money, and by 1852 all the surface gold had actually depleted, so mines were opened up, and they used quartz crystal to dig out any gold that was left. This was then used in stamp mills. I'm going to pretend that I can give you a proper scientific explanation of this, but I can't. And they used chemicals to dissolve the worthless minerals to get the gold that was inside. This had a massive impact on the environment surrounding where the gold was discovered in California, so it was obviously going to have an impact on our natives. And in 1852, 108 huge mills dominated the gold rush scene. So those that had hoped to get rich quick ended up making tiny amounts of money by working in these mills. And finally, a political impact was that California became a state in 1850. So Pikes Peak Gold Rush then, the Kansas Territory Gold Rush happened in 1858 and it was mainly around Pikes Peak, hence its name Pikes Peak Gold Rush, and this is in modern day Colorado. More than 100,000 people came to the Kansas Territory in 1859, also because there'd been an economic recession in 1857, much like the reasons for the Mormons um, moving and much like the reasons for the early migrants moving too. Lots of people were struggling and they wanted to make their fortune. Pikes Peak was quite different to the California Gold Rush because there was new railways, for example, the 600-mile railroad from St. Joseph to Pikes Peak made it easier to cross the plains than trying to get to California. So it was meant that twice the number of people actually came. And also there was town boosters as well, which made the journey, how do I say this, interesting. So there was 3 different routes into getting to Pikes Peak, where the gold rush had been, and that was because a lot of people had heard about the successes of the merchants during the California gold rush and decided to try and convince people to visit their town. So town boosters were people that wanted to boost the economy of their town. So there was 3 main routes, and what people tried to do was convince the gold rushers to use the route that went through their town so they could benefit from selling the equipment and supplies. This actually led to quite a negative consequence for some because people just made up things on their map. You come to my town, we have a water supply. They don't, or this route's shorter. It wasn't, and that was all just to make money. So lots of people ended up being lied to and quite dangerously stranded as well. So the impact of Pike Peak Gold Rush then, the growth of mining led to a development of farming on the plains that hadn't previously happened. Farmers could now make a living by selling produce to those living in towns in the gold mining districts, such as the town boosters, for example. There was also growth in population, which led to Kansas becoming a state in 1861. The plains then were no longer seen as a place just to pass through, but a place to settle and live as well. There was a changed relationship between white Americans and Native Americans, and that was because the treaties that had been signed in 1851 and 1853 that allowed white people to establish roots across American land but not settle had now been broken. White people were settling where they previously had signed a treaty to say they weren't going to. So this led to a lot of competition for land and resources between whites and natives. There was definitely more competition for supplies such as buffalo and wood and things like that because of these town boosters and because of these gold miners as well, which often did cause conflict between the natives and the white Americans, and obviously the people from other countries coming to gold mine too. In September 1859, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho met with the US authorities to make a case for themselves as well, and they weren't listened to, and conflicts actually increased. The government thought the natives should abandon their vision of the West and almost kind of accept what was happening with the gold miners. So yeah, lots more, as you'd expect, conflict between natives and white Americans, and a change in visions of the West as a whole. Suggested activity for you then is to mind map the visions of the Mormons and the visions of the gold miners, thinking about the impact of the lives of the Mormons and impact on the West of the gold miners as well. You might want to split your gold miner paragraph into Pikes Peak and California as well. Well done, thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful in your revision or consolidation of the American West. Just to remind you, we've been answering the question, how did different groups see the American West between 1839 and 1860? A final suggested activity, just to bring it all together, would be to produce a timeline of all the events that we've discussed and then to colour code the events into different groups of people like white, black or Native Americans. You might also want to colour code the different groups of visions of the West as well, so Mormons, gold miners, things like that. Hope you've enjoyed this video and well done.